All right, all right. It's good to see everybody again. It's good to be back. And we have a marvelous and wonderful program with you this morning. We are going to be interviewing a brother who has so much history over a period of time. And he wants to share a lot of the history with us. And the history is critical because uh, Jeffrey is is going to take us back to a period beginning, spanning from right after emancipation through. If you wanted to know what Black people were thinking and what they were doing and how they were organizing and what they were thinking, then that's some of what we're going to be covering today. And we'll be looking at some of the founders of African centered thought that led us to people like, I don't know why it's on the tip of my tongue, but Marcus Garvey and, well, Jeffrey, name a few of the people that we're going to look at their roots and how they all tie into.
Well, I was hoping, just because my memory, short-term memory, is not what it used to be anymore. I was really wanted to focus on Hubert Harrison and his life. He's born in 1883, but amongst the key figures in Afrocentric thought, there's certainly Harrison is one, Garvey is another. Willis Nathan Huggins comes into the story late, and I think Darrell, you have some stuff on him, because he leads a lot of study groups in the 30s, and he's just getting interacting with Harrison before Harrison dies. The pallbearers at Harrison's funeral are some major figures in Black history overall. It's Schomburg and it's George Young, the bookseller, and more and more. I mean, more people. Richard B. Moore is one who goes across several generations. But where do you want to ask questions, or would you like me to start? How do you want to proceed?
Well, I want you to start, but I just want to point out, you just talked about pallbearers, which meant that there was interaction. They were writing. They were exchanging ideas. They were formatting or bringing together a movement even back then. And we're talking about in the 18 what? What would that be?
Well, Harrison dies in 1927. That's when he dies. So I'm talking, Harrison lives from 1883 to 1927. And that's what I'd really prefer to focus on today, because that's what I'm most familiar with. I mean, I have written on the other periods, but not recently. And and Harrison is just a major figure. When he comes to New York in 1900 from St. Croix as a 17-year-old orphan, he soon starts interacting in study groups, in study circles with Johnny Bruce and Arturo Schomburg and Charles Burroughs, whose son is one of the founders of the DuSable Museum in Chicago later on, and George Young, who's at that time a well-known book dealer on 135th Street in Harlem, had 12,000 books in a relatively small stand, and they would meet they would meet regularly at lyceums on 53rd Street. This is before all the mass transit went up to Harlem. And Harrison, when he first came to the U.S., lived in the West 60s with his older sister. It was the area that had what was called the meanest tenements in New York City. And he would walk down to 63rd Street and interact with these fascinating groups of people at the churches of St. Benedict the Moor, Roman Catholic Church on 53rd Street. And that was one of the main ones. And another one right on 53rd Street. And they would hold lyceums. And these lyceums were fascinating because they'd have different speakers each week. They were places where African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans would come together and interact, because there wasn't so much of that initially. And the intellectual atmosphere was extremely stimulating. And Harrison describes, and I have all the accurate quotes in my books, but he describes how they would raise questions and they would debate back and forth, and they didn't have to agree at all, you know, and they would express their opinions, but afterwards their friendship was still maintained and they would go on. It was a very healthy intellectual atmosphere. And I think this is something that really helped shape Hubert Harrison for the remainder of his life. So he starts out early with that deep influence from Black intellectual working class circles. And these are workers. These people, I mean, Schomburg, Bruce, they all have laboring jobs. You know, they're not academics, if you will. And Harrison himself, he holds numerous low-paying jobs until 1907, until he gets a job in the Postal Service. And he lasts until 1911, when he gets fired after writing some letters critical of Booker T. Washington. He writes them in the New York Sun. Essentially, Booker T. Washington had gone to Europe and said that, oh, conditions are basically pretty fine back home for Black people. And Du Bois got together a group of people, over 50, and they signed a petition of protest. And Harrison, on his own, you know, wrote 2 letters. And he was, of course, more vulnerable than Du Bois was. And Du Bois worked with Emmett Scott and a fella, you know, in the post office, the postmaster, who they knew and was part of, if you will, the Tuskegee machine, that apparatus that that Booker T. Washington had influence with. And Harrison was summarily fired from the post office in 1911. Now, I myself was a postal worker for 32, 33 years, and I knew how to find his record. And he had an absolutely clean record until he wrote those 2 letters, and then they just fired him summarily. And so in that early period, that's some of his early shaping. Then he also teaches at a place called the White Rose Home for Colored Girls, and that was by a woman named run by a woman named Frances Reynolds Kaiser. She administered it, right? And she had worked with Mary McLeod Bethune, and it was a place where Black women from the South and the Caribbean and elsewhere, when they came to New York, they would have a safe place to stay. And particularly if they had children, there would be childcare provided and some classes. And Harrison did volunteer work there, and then he taught Black history courses in the evening. So even in the teens, when he's still young, he's interacting with people in the community, stressing the importance of Black history, learning from it. He also, I'll just say one more thing about his educational achievements. In that early years, in St. Croix, he went up to about 8th grade in high school. It was a good education, relatively, much better than that was afforded to most African-American youth down south. And when he came up, he started going to high school at nights while working a job in the days and another job 3 nights a week. But he went to high school in New York, and he got citywide honors. And they ran a headline in one of the New York dailies, "Genius Found in West Indian Student." They'd never seen anybody like this because he was getting citywide honors. So there were signs of his brilliance very young, very early. Sorry, I'll step back for a second.
Well, let me ask you, Jeffrey, because we're talking about Black people being in which areas again? Did you say 50 in the 50s? And
right.
So at that time, what is now downtown New York was essentially Little Africa, or at least significant numbers of African Americans lived in that area. And that's why you have the African burial ground that goes all the way down to what is now City Hall.
Right.
And that area is because that was an area in which Black people resided at the time. So can you kind of give us a picture of what that time may look like? And we're talking about right after slavery. So we're talking
That
about,
was at first in the area you're describing, but gradually there was a movement uptown to the West 60s, area that's called Hell's Kitchen, High 50s, West 60s, which is where Harrison first arrived at. His sister had come before him, and that was oftentimes how it happened amongst these Crucian families anyway, that a woman would be the pioneer member of the family to come, and then the other members of the family would come after. And he came and stayed with his sister, and they stayed there, and it was, as I said, it was considered the meanest tenements in New York City. That quote is from one of the publications that was put out at the time, and they created an atmosphere, particularly in the churches, because they had facilities in the West 50s. And then in 1903, the IRT subway completed its route up to Harlem. And that's when you started seeing a big exodus or a big movement up to Harlem. And Harlem shortly thereafter moved. And I mean, Harrison shortly thereafter moved, and he moves in 1907 to Harlem. And that's when he starts working in the post office also. And he's working with the White Rose Home that I mentioned. And he works and even in the post office. And I appreciated this very much, because one thing I placed at Columbia, but I had for many years, and I'll tell you the story of how I got this stuff. But Harrison's diary, he talks about after work in the post office. They did the night shift, and I used to do a similar thing 50 or more years later. We get off work at either 11 at night or 3 in the morning, the night shift, and people would go into somebody's apartment and they'd have study groups. And Harrison would do this with some of his fellow postal workers, and they would communicate with Africans abroad. They had particular correspondence that was noted in the diary with the the Black Independence Party, I believe it was. I forget the exact title, in Cuba, right? And this was that was very interesting, because there wasn't much made of that in many of the history books, but they were maintaining communication with them. And so Harrison was constantly working and interacting with his cohorts, his fellow brothers and sisters, trying to learn Black history, teach Black history, share Black history. And he read vociferously. When he died, it was said he read as many as 6 books a day. Now that's kind of staggering. But I went through all his papers, and I had his papers and his books for many years, and I could tell he knew how to approach a book. He could pick up a book, look at the cover, look at the back cover, look at the contents, the index, skim through and see what he thought was important, and then he could go after it, and he would oftentimes make marks in those books. So he just read vociferously, and he also learned, spoke or learned or read 6 languages, I believe, based on what he wrote in his diary. He got the high school honors in Latin. When he died, his daughter commented that in his last years he was teaching himself Arabic and reading the Quran, because it was it was a religion of so many people of African descent. So he's just an incredible mind, but he's also an activist who pours out heart and soul in the interest of his people, of the community. Tireless.
now we don't really have a view, I mean, in general, because it's not taught. And we don't see this kind of interchange and this kind of development mentally among African people where they are actually communicating internationally and around the world. Because there are groups in that leave the Caribbean and go to England, and they are writing and they are um, uh, talking with each other back and forth, so that there's a whole dynamics of intellectual development that is going on right after slavery, that we do not have an image or picture of African people that way. We see them somehow as just being slaves, and therefore not able to read or write or even think beyond the plantation. But you are painting a picture of African people, Africans who are coming together to search their history, to know more about themselves and the world around them, and teaching. And, it's just mind blowing when you put that other face to African intellectual origins going all the way back to Hubert Harris. Um, so if you could give us a little more of a picture, a mirror of what was going on even before uh, emancipation, that allowed this kind of academic and mental development among African people. How could that happen?
Well, I'm not really, I haven't refreshed. You're saying before emancipation. Uh, well, people up north, people would try and, study as they could, where they could. And sometimes at great difficulty, but oftentimes making great advance and achievement. Down south, it was much more difficult. Oftentimes reading was forbidden, and people would find ways to do that. I'm still amazed when I read about the education that some people had coming out of that background. But again, I can speak more in terms of Harrison. And one thing that's important in understanding in Harrison, see, in St. Croix, as opposed to the U.S., the color line, if you will, was drawn a little differently. And it has to do with social control and how the ruling class maintains social control. And in the U.S., Black people down south, particularly, it was vicious and it was so severe. Whereas in St. Croix, due to demographics, due to the history of struggle down there, and a host of other factors, but those two are very important, a sector of the African descended population was promoted kind of to a middle class status just to help maintain social control. And that's why they had an edict of full equality passed back in St. Croix, and in the principal instrument of social control, the militia. Some free coloreds were involved in that, whereas in the U.S., the slave patrols were lily white. There was no edict of full equality. We had laws that said no Black person had any rights that a white was bound to respect. It was a different atmosphere. And Harrison commented on it. Claude McKay, who came from Jamaica, commented on it. Marcus Garvey commented on it. When they came here, Claude McKay said something to the effect he had heard about racism being so severe in this country, but he never imagined it being as bad as it was, right? And Harrison had a similar comment after he came in 1900. In 1903, as he's reading and writing about lynching, he says he was utterly shocked that this was going on, right? Again, there was a little more leeway, because there's amongst the African people, there's always a desire to read, but to have access to it and to have access without facing severe punishment is a key factor and issue in all of this.
Thank you. Now, who are some of those people who we now look at, and we look at them as having influenced the early African-centered movement, like Marcus Garvey, and you mentioned Booker T. Washington, but can you speak of Hubert Harrison and his relationship to some of these early pioneers that was influenced and had some of their lasting impact even after Harris had passed on, but
Okay.
he laid the foundation for them.
Yeah. Well, Harrison really is a pioneer, and that's why I'm glad we finally have this two-volume biography out. I just want to mention for people who may be listening, if they're not aware, this is the first full-length multi-volume biography of an Afro-Caribbean, and only the fourth of an Afro-American after those of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Langston Hughes. I say full-length multi-volume. So Harrison is a giant, and he's being finally treated as such. And the first volume is 600 pages. The second volume is 1,000 pages with copious notes, very detailed notes. And I'm coming back to your question, but one more thing I want to mention about the notes. When you go through the notes, particularly in volume 2, I oftentimes will link to an article or a book online. So Harrison was a great book reviewer. He was said to be the first regular Black book reviewer, and the phrase was in Negro newspaperdom. And he would review books, and he was brilliant. But a lot of the books people today might not have heard of, but I've tried wherever possible to link to permanent sites online, Hathy Trust or Internet Archive, where the books are there. So the very book that Harrison is reviewing, the reader can click to and go see and take a look for themselves. So coming back, Harrison arrives, and Booker T is a dominant force in amongst Black Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois is another major force, and William Monroe Trotter. They start the Niagara movement. But Booker T still is most powerful in the period when Harrison's first coming of age, and he's critical of Booker T. Washington. He has scrapbooks. Harrison kept scrapbooks. He's a major. Today we have computer files and discs and things like this. Harrison lived in poverty his whole life, but he kept scrapbooks where he would take a magazine and put newspaper articles or letters, and he'd paste them into these scrapbooks. Over 40 remain. And in his scrapbooks, he had one on what he called subservience. And he paid a lot of attention to Booker T. Washington in that scrapbook because, there was a quote from Booker T. Washington about whatever president, I think it was Roosevelt, I forget which president Booker T. was referring to at the time, wants, I will do, or something like that. He more or less, Booker T. wanted to concentrate work in the African community, but separately and not challenge things. And Harrison was critical of that position after a while, as was Du Bois. As I said, when Booker T. goes to Washington and says things are fine, Harrison and Du Bois both criticize him. So Harrison then starts out, and he considers himself a bit of a Du Bois man, is what he calls himself. And Du Bois was kind of the leading figure in the opposition to Booker T. Washington, he and William Monroe Trotter of Boston. But there were things about Du Bois's philosophy that Harrison criticized. Harrison always was a very independent thinker. And even today, I think he will cause thought amongst readers today, because what he's saying, we'll read and think about how it was then, but we might think about how does this apply today also. And he was critical of Booker T, of W.E.B. Du Bois. He didn't agree with the concept of the talented 10th, which was one that Du Bois based a lot of his work on in the early period. Du Bois said the talented 10th were those who must be made leaders of teaching and thought amongst our race. And the talented 10th, basically, implicit in the notion of the talented 10th were offsprings of white and European American, African American ancestry in general. Another thing that Du Bois pushed for, Du Bois was with the NAACP, and Harrison early was critical of the NAACP, starting from when it was being founded. When it was being founded, Harrison commented on the founding meetings in New York City, where some speakers spoke openly and critically about the white activists in that era. And when the coverage of those meetings came out, those comments were taken out. They were elided. And Harrison says, this is no way to begin this organization. You don't want this organization to be one where Black ideas and practices are shaped by white people's expectations of how Black people should act. So he's early developing those criticism, and then he develops a major criticism of Du Bois during World War I, a criticism which years later Du Bois acknowledged was correct. And that was during World War I, when the U.S. went to war. And Du Bois, by the way, and another issue I get into in these books, Du Bois was editor of the Crisis magazine, and he was getting funded by Joel A. Spingarn, who was head of the NAACP, but he would go off and personally give him financial aid, and he'd get money elsewhere from grants, Du Bois would, and other things. And Du Bois, Spingarn was opposed to, he was a major in military intelligence during World War I, and he didn't want to see any Black opposition. And he had much influence on Du Bois. Du Bois makes his own decisions, but during World War I, Du Bois writes an editorial entitled Close Ranks. It's a very short editorial in the Crisis, and it says, inside of it, it says, while this war lasts, let us forget our special grievances. And Harrison and everybody else knew what those special grievances were: lynching, segregation, and disfranchisement. So Harrison follows up in a rejoinder to that and takes Du Bois to task very seriously. And Du Bois is stung. I mean, Du Bois never wants to really talk to Harrison again. There's some minor communication later on, and criticizes that position articulately. And then he and William Monroe Trotter, who had been active with Du Bois a decade earlier, now it's Harrison and Trotter in Washington hold a National Liberty Congress to push for demands for equality for African Americans during World War I. It's the major Black protest effort during World War I, and they're Black men and women from 35 states, and women included, and they meet in Washington, D.C. And again, so Harrison has now broken from Booker T, and he's broken from Du Bois. Now, in the period right before that, the Liberty Congress in 1917, Harrison founds the Liberty League and the Voice. They are respectively the first organization and the first newspaper of the Militant New Negro organization, or New Negro movement. And please note the date. This is 1917. This is 8 years before Alain Leroy Locke's book on the New Negro, because a lot of the historiography that has come out in recent years talks about the New Negro and Alain Leroy Locke and this literary movement. Harrison's extraordinarily literary, but his New Negro movement is also extremely political. And Harrison so founds this organization, and he founds this newspaper, and he's doing much agitation around these things in 1917, 1918, through 1919 with The Voice. And in the period of 1917, when he founds it, he's attracting a lot of attention. And Marcus Garvey, who you mentioned, Marcus Garvey is coming to Harrison's meetings of the Liberty League. And Marcus Garvey actually joins Hubert Harrison's Liberty League. Now, for those familiar with Marcus Garvey, he's really not one to join anyone else's organization. You know, it's not his style. And he joins, and he, by accounts of numerous contemporaries, Harrison was the major radical influence on Marcus Garvey in this period and for ensuing years. And I document these statements, I'm not just speaking wildly, very carefully with footnotes and material that people can see for themselves, you know, online or in books. And so he's a major influence on Garvey. But Garvey, as a matter of fact, Garvey starts holding meetings down the hall from where Harrison is. And Garvey's organization grows a little. Harrison's runs into some problems, partly with finance. One of the reasons Harrison runs into problems over finance is he gets offered $10,000, which is an incredibly large sum of money, by a white patron, and he declines it. He goes, "No, I don't want that money. We want to control the thinking and what we put out ourselves," you know, which is a bold position, because others, like, as I mentioned, Du Bois or A. Philip Randolph and A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, they accept money, you know, from these, or some of the people who are close to the Communist Party, Cyril Briggs, they accept money from these sources. And Harrison, for the most part, you know, he declined and he wanted to go an independent road. And it's not really until late 1919 that Garvey's organization really takes off. And in that period, at the very end of 1919, Garvey approaches Harrison in Harlem and asks him if he would like to teach a course, lead education for a college that Garvey was planning to start in Africa. So Harrison said, "Give me a week to think about it." And then when they met again, Garvey said, well, he really wants him to work on his newspaper, the Negro World. And Harrison, in the first week of January 1920, starts working at the Negro World, and he quickly becomes the unofficial managing editor, particularly throughout 1920, but he's writing regularly through 1922. And in that 1920 period, the paper sweeps the globe. It's radical, it's political, it's literary. And Harrison describes in his diary, and I describe in the book, all the steps he took to reshape it. And, you know, from how he handled headlines to how he got people to write and sign articles. And he starts West Indian news notes and book review section, and gets, again, a lot of his friends to start writing, like Claude McKay and Bruce and Schomburg, to submit articles. And in that period, Harrison also has in his diary and in his papers lists of newspapers where he sent both that paper, and in earlier and later periods where he sent his own papers, The Voice, and a later paper called The Voice of the Negro. That was his last paper. And he's sending these to papers all over the globe, African papers, Caribbean papers. So he's a great internationalist. But so of three major literary figures, he's also, besides Du Bois, Booker T, and Garvey, A. Philip Randolph, another major figure in that period, refers to Hubert Harrison as the father of Harlem radicalism. And A. Philip Randolph is following Harrison in the early years, particularly when he's moving into the Socialist Party, because Randolph and Owen had dabbled with Democrats and socialists for a while, and Harrison kind of set them on the direction towards the socialists. Although Harrison broke with the socialists at a certain point because he felt that the Socialist Party and the labor movement put the white race first before class. A stunning critique, which it's unfortunate people hadn't heard of or weren't familiar with for about 100 years. You know, we could have learned much from that, from Harrison. Excuse me, I'll let you ask another question.
Okay. I want to comment in terms of how close this period is to us today. And we seem to think that slavery was a long time ago. But Dr. Clarke was also one of the people who, and not only Dr. Clarke, but all of the African-centered scholars that we look at and we honor and we give praise to, come out of the influence of the brothers of that period. You talk about A. Philip Randolph, who was who was there with Dr. King, and so I'm just pointing out that this period is right here. I mean, it's not something that is buried in history, but I can reach back and touch it. My mother and father was born during the time of A. Philip of Booker T. Washington. They were born in South Carolina, and they were born before Booker T. Washington died. They knew of George Washington Carver. I mean, all of this thinking and work that they put in was really just yesterday, just a stone throw away from where we ourselves can touch it. So we need to know this history so that we can call upon these brothers and sisters who literally gave us their lives in order to make things better. And what they lay out for us is that we have, as a people, been thinking and been grappling with struggling for our people to make our condition better. And not only that, but make the world a better place to live, because of how we saw the world. And that goes all the way deep back into our African concept of the world, of our worldview. Now, when you talk about Elaine Locke, I wish you would speak a little bit, if you would, about his thinking and how it his worldview shaped the philosophical understanding of African thought, and how that passes on to us today. Would you do that for us, Jeffrey?
I'll try do a little bit. Alain Locke was very brilliant and did some wonderful research, a lot of which wasn't even published until many years later. But he attracted most attention, I think, around 1925 when he put out a publication entitled The New Negro, with some people, Kellogg money was involved, and Kellogg Foundation. I don't know if it's Kellogg Foundation, but and they were publishers in New York, and they a year earlier they started putting together the articles that were to go into the New Negro, and this is where Harrison enters the story. And they had a list of proposed articles, including one by Hubert Harrison. And I believe it was the White World, the White War and the Colored World, I think. I have it specifically mentioned in the book, which he had written during World War I. And it was considered too radical for the radical papers. And I think I cited the possibility that they were referring to The Messenger of Randolph and Owen, and maybe a Socialist Party paper. They wouldn't print it because Harrison had a stunning critique of white supremacy internationally. And Harrison's article was one of the ones scheduled to be included in the printing of the New Negro. And then in late 1924, as the publication was being finalized, Harrison's article was pulled out. And so the publication came out, Alain Locke's publication, New Negro, and it was primarily a literary publication. And it didn't have that political critique so much that Harrison offered. And that was one of Harrison's criticisms of the New Negro movement. And that's why I stress in my writing about him that his was a radical militant New Negro movement that he founded. Because there are historians today will talk about the New Negro, and they'll talk about, you know, start way back. Somebody used the phrase in 1895, somebody used the phrase here or there, and they'll jump to Alain Locke and the story unfolds, and they just jump right over Hubert Harrison. And that's unfortunate because the content of what he was bringing is truly significant. Now, Tony Martin is a very fine historian of the Garvey movement and the Black experience before he died. And he wrote a book entitled Literary Garveyism. And it focuses on the writings, the literary writings of the New Negro in the period around 1920-21 when Harrison was there. And he raves about how influential it was, how political, how literary and brilliant it was. But Martin, unfortunately, did not know that at that time, Harrison was the managing editor and putting it all together. And it would have just, you know, deepened the story a little bit, I think. So Locke does put out a worthy publication. It attracts a lot of the younger generation of artists and writers, and you know, it receives much acclaim. You know, but I always, being familiar with Harrison, I always wished that the Harrison piece would have been included, and maybe just a broader and deeper perspective would have been added to it.
I was on the tip of the tongue is the name that I want you to include within this period. He also spoke about, and the reason why I'm saying he also spoke about is because for some reason I just can't pull the name, but he spoke several languages. He traveled all over the world. He was an actor. He was he was a great thinker, and he influenced the Black movement. I think he was he was associated with communism, which
so McCabe, Paul Robeson, any of those names? No. Claude McCabe, Paul Robeson, no.
Both of them, both of the names would be within that time period. But I'm speaking of the brother with that deep voice, and he was an actor as well.
Paul Robeson.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, you want me to?
Yeah.
I'm familiar with Robeson's background a bit, and I was just down. I had a friend, Romus Broadway, who passed away within the past 2 years, who had a major collection of photos from the Princeton African American community, which is where Robeson grew up. And we're trying to place them in a major repository. So I've been going over some things about Robeson's life. And I haven't really found places where Harrison has an opportunity to interact directly with Robeson. But when he's young and he's writing The Voice, Harrison, one of the Islanda Cardoza Good is one of the distributors for The Voice, and she becomes Mrs. Paul Robeson, as I recall, right? Islanda Cardoza Good Robeson, and she's distributing the paper, and her mother was, I think, knew Harrison. So in-laws, in relation to in-laws, Harrison had some contact, but then Harrison also does a stunning critique of the play The Emperor Jones. And The Emperor Jones was a very famous play by Eugene O'Neill. And I think when Harrison reviews it, Charles Gilpin, who was the leading Black actor of his day, had the lead. Later, Robeson became, very famous for playing that role so well. But Harrison writes a review of that play, The Emperor Jones, and it prompts O'Neill to write to Harrison and rave about the review, and also to say something which I used in the beginning of my opening chapter of this last volume. Aside from everything else, he talks about that. And in the book, by the way, in the review, Harrison implicitly makes a comparison of the Emperor Jones with Marcus Garvey. That's a subject for a later time, perhaps. But in his comments to Harrison, Eugene O'Neill writes to Harrison to portray an individual, not to propagandize an individual, but to portray an individual is what matters. In other words, have that intellectual integrity. And when I'm writing the introduction to volume 2 of my book, I key on three or four passages, three to come immediately to mind, where Harrison, when he starts his diary, and it's a fascinating passage where he says, I'm going to start this diary. This is the second copy of his diary. It's in 1907. And he kept his diary for basically the remainder of his life. And he says, I'm going to start this diary, and I'm going to put down things as they happen. I'm not going to try and frame them in a better light or anything. I'm going to write them as they happen. I think it will help me and others to understand. He had a sense that others might come after him to read what he was writing. And I'm not going to embellish, and this is the way Harrison even approached his diary, which is very helpful for people like us who come afterwards and want to learn from him. And then the third comment, there's the Harrison comment, the Eugene O'Neill comment, and then J.A. Rogers. Rogers was a great fan of Harrison's and a close friend. And he, of course, wrote World's Great Men of Color and many other very important works. And in World's Great Men of Color, he has a stunning chapter on Harrison, one of the best I've ever read. But in that chapter, he says, he's got one passage that reads, no man is perfect to his valet, which of course is true. And he goes on to say, and that is certainly the case with Hubert Harrison. He goes, but that does not remove us from his excellence, his importance, or that does not deny his importance. And I think that's very important. And that helped me when I'm trying to write a biography of Hubert Harrison, because when I write, he stands on his own. I let him speak virtually throughout the volumes, and he's remarkable. But, there's things he does sometimes that can be questioned or criticized. And they're in there because I think it's important to put the whole story in so we all can learn, right? And profit by. So now when we come back to today, because your question also regarded today, I think if people read this, and it's a big book, it's going to take a while. One scholar, a professor up at Cornell, said, this book is so big, I'm going to read only a chapter a day. And she said, but if you read this book and take in what Harrison is saying, he's just got so much to offer. I think there's much to be learned, and I hope people will draw from it in the spirit that I think Harrison would have liked it to be written, in the spirit that I wrote it. And for now, that's what I've got.
No, I just want to make it because often we don't give enough understanding, enough weight to how history shapes what we both think today, what we do today, and what we will do tomorrow. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview with Jeffrey on Hubert Harris is so, as he talks about Hubert Harris and covers the impact Harris had on most of the African-centered scholars that have impacted and impressed and became our primary guardians of this information. He had an influence. But by looking at that, you can see how their thinking shaped what we have done, and even including Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. They did not come to us out of a vacuum. They were impressed and guided and exchanged the depth of our understanding of both our present condition, our past condition, and the condition of humanity through the way they saw the world and the way that they tried to move us forward in it, so that we learn about more about those people who was around Hubert Harris during the same period and what they thought and what they did. And so it's a great way, and it's really the most profound way for us to learn history and to learn ourselves, is to learn what those who came before us, the stands they took, the thoughts they had, and how they committed themselves and worked to bring us to this point. The respect that we gain from knowing them, because we don't have to repeat a lot of the things that they did. It's just like the father of Black history. He said that if you teach a person how to think, if you can control his mind, you won't have to worry about how he thinks. If he comes to a white person's, and I'm paraphrasing, house, and he's been taught that he go to the back door, and if there is no back door, the way you think, thinking that there should be one for you to go in, you create one for yourself. And that's so true. And so I just wanted to talk about these things because they give us an insight to why we act and think the way we do today, and how to correct it and how to move forward. They give us an insight to how white people, the European thinks. All you got to do is look at Frederick Douglass, read his 4th of July. Why have y'all invited me to speak on this day, and how he was treated, and his response to that? You know, it's invaluable. You can't replace that. And as I was saying, it's only yesterday that these things happen. Only yesterday. You can reach back and you can touch them. And we must teach our children these lessons and who these people were. If you don't, we leave a gap, a gulf so wide that we can't get over it. And we'll just be floating in the midst of thin air without a bridge to hold on to. So I know that Darrell is here with us, and I want to give him an opportunity to talk with Brother Perry and ask Brother Perry any questions that he has. Brother Darrell, are you with us? Brother Darrell? Well, yeah, there you go.
How you doing?
Oh, I just want to talk about.
From South Africa, one of the people that Harrison had communication with and wrote reviews of his works, and that'll be in volume 2. Well, you've got volume 2, I think, now too, right? You have volume 2 now, is that correct? Yeah, you'll see Harrison does some reviews of Saul Plott, and he also has some correspondence with him, you know. And Platt was one of the founders of the Communist Party of South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to mention, while Darrell pulling that stuff together, some of the other people that Harrison influenced. One who I'm so interested in finding out more about is Willis and Huggins, who ran in the 1930s the study groups, that included, I think, John Henry Clarke and John G. Jackson and a host of other people, because he dies mysteriously in 1941. I don't know if you're familiar with this, allegedly off the George Washington Bridge. I'm always suspicious when I hear these stories. But he got to know Harrison shortly before Harrison died, but he was apparently a brilliant thinker, following in the line of Harrison and others. And regarding Douglass that you mentioned, Harrison, again in volume 2, and I cover this, did wonderful talks on Frederick Douglass and also on Lincoln versus Liberty, where he talks about the struggle while Lincoln's alive and post-Lincoln of African American peoples for their freedoms and their liberties. And what's interesting about that is Harrison's critique of Lincoln. He says, well, Lincoln, he did some good things, but we got to look more closely at this, because Lincoln was saying the Republican Party is the ship and all else is the sea, and we've got, or Douglass said that, but Lincoln represented that. And so Harrison is critical of Lincoln a bit also, and he writes in that fashion. And years later, Lerone Bennett Jr. writes a very good book, critical of Lincoln, that doesn't get almost any publicity at all. And somewhat similar themes get picked up by Eric Foner, who's a major historian at Columbia, and gets much more attention to it. But neither one of them, as far as I can recall, mentioned Harrison's estimation of Lincoln, which they seemingly would almost seemingly draw from, although they don't cite it at all. I'm sorry for cutting in there. Then I really want to hear what you got to say. Do we lose him?
Yeah, Darrell? You
Darrell?
with us? Yeah, Darrell, are you with us?
Oh, I had nothing else to say. That was it.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on.
Oh, okay.
Richard B. Moore.
Yes, I'd like to comment on that too. A good friend of Harrison, and it's Richard B. Moore, who points out that Harrison was such an extraordinary internationalist, and that he always held the interests of African peoples to the fore. And I cite that in the opening chapter again. But even more on Moore, if you show that picture again, Darrell, that book is written by Joyce Moore Turner, or edited by, I believe, Joyce Moore Turner, maybe with her husband. Let me see what we got on that one. Richard B. Moore, pick it up a little bit. And her husband, who passed away, W. Burghardt Turner. But Joyce Moore Turner is 100 years old now. I still stay in touch with her. I last spoke with her about 5 days ago for 45 minutes. In August of this year, 2020, she had an article on Ethelred Brown published in the Journal of Caribbean History at 100 years old. And she's got it all together, and she's a good, sharp critic of all these things, and amazing person. And, all praise to her.
Okay, I got another person.
Okay. Let me see, who's that?
Ezekiel Way.
Yeah. Now, I'm not so familiar with him. That's probably my shortcomings, right? Yeah. Now you're going to start. You got some books there, though. Wow. Bruce Gritt, right. Now, Harrison and Gritt were friends basically from 2005 or so until Harrison dies in 1905 to 1927. Yes. Harrison, I've got some comments on that. And of course, he's writing around the early teens, and his writings get picked up later by Harrison and by Garvey, right? And I'm trying to think if Harrison had any personal contact with him. I'm not sure, but he gets mentioned at several points in Volume 2.
Alexander Crummell.
Harrison, right. Harrison writes about him and speaks about him. And if you pick it up, Wilson J. Moses, I believe, right? The author? Yes, I just spoke with him or corresponded with him last week, because Moses the author is a very important independent thinker. And he's interested in doing a review on the Harrison book right now. And he's been corresponding with me about that. He wrote a wonderful review for Volume 1. But one of the problems we're having, believe it or not, with the Harrison book, that's why I was pleased to see that you have it, is Columbia University Press notified me about 2 or 3 days ago. The book only came out at the end of November, early December, and they said they're out of the first printing already. There's much interest in Hubert Harrison. So they've already ordered a new printing, which hopefully will be out soon. But I don't think Wilson Moses had got his copy yet. I'm trying to see if there's some way I can get him something down in D.C. He's in D.C. area, as I recall, yeah. And but he's somebody who I respect very much, his writings and his thinking. And he's another working class Black intellectual, comes out of Detroit. I encourage people to become familiar with his work.
T. McCants Stewart.
Now I'm trying to think. I think he's mentioned in the book, but I don't know that I have much to offer on that right now. You've got quite a collection now. That's amazing. That's good. Well, by the way, after all this is over, at some point I want to talk with you folks. What are you going to do with your collections, and how are you going to place them and handle them? Because I too have a major collection. I've already placed the Hubert Harrison, the major Hubert Harrison papers at Columbia, and the Theodore W. Allen papers at UMass Amherst, which is where Du Bois's papers are. And I've placed about 100 boxes of my postal and labor papers, because I was an activist for 30 some odd years in the labor movement. But I still have around here, one on top of the other, about 500 boxes and 7,000 books that I want to place someplace where they'll be preserved and utilized. And it's mostly race and class, a good collection. I have a good eye, as do you. Yeah. Yep, I have that. And now Seifert was one of the pallbearers at Harrison's funeral. And he goes back to the Liberty League with Harrison. And as I recall, it was Seifert, and I mentioned this accurately in the book, but I think it was Seifert who suggested the notion, I hope I get this right, but if not, we can check in the book, when he was with the Liberty League, for a tricolor flag. And Harrison's tricolor flag was red, black, and green, because he said that's the colors we are, referring to peoples of color worldwide. And subsequently, Garvey took the tricolor notion and switched to black, red, and green. Black, red, and green. Harrison's was black, brown, and yellow. Garvey switched red, black, and green.
Now,
Seifert was a good friend of Harrison. He was in some of the study groups that Harrison ran and things like that. So there's a lot of connections, as you can see, with Harrison. And Harrison, Dr. Ben, I don't think Dr. Ben ever saw Harrison in person, but he was a big fan of Harrison's. I got to meet Dr. Ben and know him slightly later on. And on the front page of my website, there's a little picture of Dr. Ben and Harrison's daughter and I and another friend, Isa Anate, outside the Schomburg Center when we're getting petitions to rename 134th Street and Lenox Avenue after Hubert Harrison. And Dr. Ben's there, and he's got the copy of the book, and we're talking a little bit. And he was a good fan of his. John G. Jackson was a very good fan of Harrison, and he wrote a pamphlet that still gets around quite a bit, Hubert Harrison, The Black Socrates, which is based on, that phrase was used by Pickens, William Pickens, way back into 23 and 27. And I think Jackson saw Harrison speak and maybe was in some study groups with Harrison or classes. I have a picture of a class that Harrison was teaching on world problems of race, which is the picture that's on the cover of volume 2. And you don't get the whole scope of who's in that class, but inside the book is the complete picture. I can identify in that picture Richard B. Moore, W.A. Domingo, I believe Williana Jones Burroughs, Hermie Weiswood, and now I'm looking to see if I can see this Willis N. Huggins, who I mentioned, since I've seen a picture of him recently. But Darrell, since you're so good at all this too, you might be able to identify some other people in that photo, and I would really appreciate it. I think others would appreciate it if you can identify some of the other faces in that photo when you get a chance.
Well, while the book is still looking, again, I want to thank you, Brother Jeffrey, for your commitment, your work, your dedication to bringing forth this history. I'd like for you to comment, though, on how does this, knowing this particular history in this particular time of Trump and what is happening in this country between the races, and not only just black and white, but the entire structure of the United States as a democratic institution. How does knowing this knowledge affect what is happening? How does it help us either contribute to making it better, contribute to our own struggle within it? Can you talk on that for a moment?
Sure, and thank you for asking that. I think that's a very important question, and that's essentially how I came, asking questions like that, of course, well before Trump, is how I came to Hubert Harrison. I started out, I'm working in the post office and I'm an activist, and we were involved in strikes. I get fired, you know, all kinds of labor battles that working people go through oftentimes in their lives. And I'm writing on why the left in the United States had not been more successful at efforts at social change. This is around 1980. I'm writing this. And in the course of that, I come across a chapter, or two, actually, I came across 2 chapters on Hubert Harrison. One was by Foner and one was by Richard B. Moore. And I say, who is this guy? I didn't know who he was. So I went up to the Schomburg Center and I was able to find microfilms of his 2 books, The Negro and a Nation, written in 1917, and When Africa Awakes, the inside story of the new Negro in the Western world, of the stirrings and strivings of the new Negro in the Western world. So I put my money in and I printed out copies of these books and I took them home and read them. And I thought I was arrested. He was the clearest thinker of that early period on issues of race and class that I had come across. And a friend of mine, a fellow named Winston James, who writes on Caribbean radicalism and stuff, some years later told me he had a similar reaction when he came across Harrison. So I started, I said, gee, I got to write on this Harrison. So this is how I wound up getting the papers and everything. I write out a few chapters. I wound up meeting his family. They entrust me with these materials. And it's a long journey after that. But what struck me about Harrison in particular was the following. He understood the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy, the social change efforts in this country. White supremacy was the base on which this existing set of relations was solidified upon. And if we're going to deal with it, we have to take that issue on head on. We can't put it as item number 7 in our laundry list or anything like that. And he was very clear on the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy. And he was also very clear that the struggle against white supremacy for European Americans was in their interest. It was, it was in their interest. It was not in their interest to be racist or to try to maintain privileges or anything. What was in their interest was solidarity and fighting with fellow brothers and sisters, African Americans and others. But he was clear on that. And that's why when he was in the Socialist Party, he was so effective. I mean, he spoke before 50,000 people when he was in the Socialist Party. He went down to Wall and Broad Street at 1 PM and spoke for as far as the voice could reach for 3 hours on socialism. And I refer to that, slyly a little bit as the first Occupy Wall Street. That was in 1911. And he was just very clear and very sharp, but he wound up leaving the socialists, and he was critical of the labor movement. And his reasons very simply were because the Socialist Party leaders and the labor movement leaders put the white race first before class. And in this volume, I point out that is a profound lesson, and it's too bad that people hadn't heeded it, hadn't paid more attention to it for the past 100 years. It's still the issue we have to deal with. So that's one major way that Harrison has so much to offer us, the centrality of that struggle, and that it's whose interest it really is in to oppose that. It's certainly in African Americans' interest, but it's also in the interest of laboring class people. Another thing that I found increasingly interesting as I went through this volume were questions of leadership and who leads movements, where they get their funding, how they maintain it, what type image they put out, and at various points, I jump ahead and I look at what Trump is doing. And I see sometimes striking similarities. I say, wow, but I'll leave that for the readers. I'll leave that for the readers. But, there's so much of what Harrison faced back then that will be familiar with people today. Sorry.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Darrell, I see you have a guest for us. So do you want to introduce the brother? Let us know who he is.
You're on mute.
Yes. He's here with his daughter.
Two guests.
Good evening, gents.
How you doing?
I'm very well, very well. Yeah, there's two of us here. This is my daughter. My name's Kwabna Osei-Mwati. Minister Clemson, I spoke to you previously. I think it was a good 7-8 months ago now.
How you doing, brother? And
I'm very well. And this is my lovely daughter, Maya.
Hi, Maya.
Hello, Maya.
I tried to keep her off the call, but I wasn't winning. And Mr. Perry, nice to meet you as well.
Very pleased to meet you. Jeff, you can call me Jeff, please.
Nice to meet you. Darrell told me that you guys were going to be having a conversation, and he asked if I would like to sort of peep in and visit in and say hello. So I guess I'll let him do an introduction as well.
Well, we're glad to have you, Kwabna, and we'd like for you to go ahead on and get involved. and especially with the question I just asked Jeffrey in regard to how this kind of information can help us with the problems we're having today, because these same problems are not just germane to what's happening here in America with African Americans. The same thing is happening there in England where you are. You're in England, right?
I live in London, correct. So I was born and raised here, and I spend most of my time here. My family's here.
So African people primarily are facing this struggle together.
Yes.
And it's a world struggle, both to save humanity or to make humanity a better place.
Correct.
For all of us to live. So in regard to how you see this information, I'd like to have your input on that, because it's something we all need to look at.
Yeah, I caught just probably the last 5-10 minutes of what Jeff was talking about in relation to the volumes that he's worked on regarding Hubert Harrison, and the fact that I believe, and I think we're all lovers of history here, history is a steer, and history rarely is wrong. History rarely sets us on the wrong path if we choose to listen to it. And I think what I heard from Jeff was this statement that the centrality of the battle against white supremacy has always hinged on the fact that it's fought us based on race and not as on class, especially in terms of the labor movements and for the working classes of this world. And obviously, as we know, so much of our community is part of the working class. And I think that's a really important statement, because I think now, 100 years later, we're starting to forget that central fact that if indeed the enemy is white supremacy as an ideology, then I think we're sometimes forgetting, because of the various, I suppose, social stratas that we think we currently exist in, we're forgetting that the battle is still against our race as a totality, and not the individual class levels that we may perceive ourselves to sit in. So I think that's really important for people not to forget. I think it's important that obviously the key issues haven't changed in 100 years. The battlegrounds may have, but the key central issues have not changed, and therefore, how far have we come? And if we deem ourselves not to have come so far, if the key issues haven't changed, maybe it's time that people start considering a change of strategy. Because, you know, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. And I mentioned that this year more than ever, because obviously it's been quite a poignant year in terms of protests, which has been a key part of our movement, I suppose, or the civil/human rights movement over the past 50, 60, 70 years. And we've had huge protests this year, especially after the George Floyd incident. Fast forward 6 months, the world has a different pressing issue. How far have we come? How effective were those protests? Secondly to that, we're coming out of a political period, especially in North America, where there's been a relatively divisive precedent. After an 8-year period where, from our community point of view, from the black community, we had a black president, but we've come out of a 4-year period where there's been an election in America where the people have chosen someone else apart from Trump. And I guess there is a hope for some that there's going to be change based purely on the fact that there's a new political party on board. And again, I have quite a bit of pessimism as to whether that's going to make a huge difference to the problem, because over the past 20, 30 years, that hasn't seemed to help. So what's our strategy? Are we going to continue believing in the process of democratic votes to solve our issues? Are we going to be believing in the way we protest at the moment? Those are the issues we continue to consider in the decade ahead.
Let me say this, because unless we can kind of get clear on what is really happening, we won't have the space we need to analyze what is going on. If you even speak of communism, socialism, or even the historic African relationship with itself, which was a form of socialism, communism, and also independence, self-independent, where our society supported whatever we needed to be one and whole with each other. If you even mention socialism, you have a stigma put on you, and you can be more or less pushed away from opportunities or opening, because you even just want to discuss what it is. If you want to know more in depth what socialism is, what it stands for, how it operates, any of that, you can be isolated from certain jobs. You know, there's a penalty for even discussing it. So it's kind of like the Bible in a way, and I'm saying in a way that if you read the Bible, or if you say that the Bible is not the absolute and unadulterated word of God, then you are sinful, and you can't have that conversation among most Christians because you disagree with God's word. Well, in a way, to talk about or to want to look at what are the benefits, if there are any, and what are the negative aspects of socialism, communism, and the traditional African um, uh, social systems, then you're seen as wrong, and you can be punished for that.
Of course.
And so this is one of the reasons why Black people don't have a good understanding of themselves and their history and their social structures. It's because they have been labeled anti democracy when they were the most democratized societies on the planet. And so all of the things that bring out our principles of how we should be living and how we should understand how nature operates is excluded from our ability to incorporate them in our social structure because they're seen as negative and as somehow a threat to the system. So that's my comment on why we really need to study and look at the history of how all of this evolved.
I definitely agree with you, Minister Brown, and I would say that there's many people that are having insight into some of the historic social systems we had in Africa, some of the principles that those of us that appreciate our way of life, how they form themselves. But I think one of the issues now is that many of the individuals that have that understanding are not in the position of influence politically. And I think that's going to be the challenge for the next batch or the next generation of, let's call them missionaries, people that want to contribute to the struggle, but now actually want to do it in a place where it might have a different type of impact. So I definitely feel like many more of us are going to have to consider political participation, because typically if you were to set up some sort of movement or a party, obviously the amount of funding and the amount of the amount of resources that would be needed, especially in an African state, to give that party a chance of having any credible sort of influence in a particular government or any particular party would be very, very difficult. So I think so many people now have to be open-minded to join certain political parties, any political parties that are closer to their own ideology or principles, and work from within. Otherwise, we may well have the situation whereby we spend the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, I suppose, agitating and protesting from the periphery. And I wonder whether just if many more of us were involved in parties and trying to have a voice within, if that in itself would be a strategic change and would give us an opportunity to have lobbying power within the powers that be. So whether it's in, I don't know, an African country, in my case, I couldn't see myself joining a political party in Europe because I don't consider myself an Englishman. But there's political parties that we have in Ghana. They all have certain things that you're not going to agree with. And but I guess for someone like myself, I have to sort of get involved in one area or the other and then try and work within, even though it's going to be a pretty difficult battle, because so many of these people, they've forgotten, or they don't want to, they're not reminded of some of the principles and some of the historical ways that we've conducted ourselves as Africans. And I think that many more of us should get involved and try and lobby.
Thank you so much. By the way, we did get in contact with Pepe Kai and was able to talk to him. And did you give Darrell Pepe Kai's number? How did you get Pepe Kai's number? Darrell? how did you get Pepe Kai's number? I was
mute, Darrell.
Darrell done cut his mic off. Anyway, no, I was asking you, how did we get Pepe Kai's number? I thought Kwabena gave it to you.
No, he didn't give it to me. Whoever I talked to on Instagram gave it to me.
Oh, okay.
Darrell is one of the most connected people on the planet. I mean, in terms of having his file of facts is knee deep with great friends and connections and people that are trying to contribute to the struggle. So yeah, he's a top guy.
Okay, now we were looking at the possibility of pulling together another talk on the subject that we are now communicating with, and Brother Robin, we was hoping we could get him to participate on this because he can really deal with ancient African history from the perspective of how Africans saw the world and how they codified it. You know, if you look at the 7 principles that kind of guide us along in terms of vibration, opposites, you know, so forth and so on.
Yeah.
Those are African understandings of how the universe. There he is.
Yeah.
So we're going to ask you, can you get in contact with Brother Robin and see if he would join us? We want to talk about the slave trade. That's important because we really don't have an understanding of slavery.
Yeah.
From how it really comes about and how it develops, because we don't factor in the Arab aspect of it, and we don't separate the Arab aspect from the African Arabs of an area that was once African and how it slowly converted into a Arab-dominated control that ended up oppressing and enslaving African people. And once it was mixed, how the religion then comes the dominant factor.
Yeah.
Who's enslaved and what culture goes forth.
Yes.
So we need a clear understanding and view of that.
I've never had the pleasure of meeting Robin Walker. I've seen plenty of his work. I know he's an extremely learned uncle in those fields, and but I know some people that are far closer to him than I am, and I can try and reach out to them and see if they're able to make an appropriate introduction to Darrell and to yourself. I know you guys we're all in the business, especially you guys, you're in the business of spreading information and truth. So I'm sure he'll be very happy to speak to you guys. But I've never met him personally, and I don't know him personally, but I know that he's an extremely learned individual. I think we're talking obviously history, and I mentioned earlier on that I do believe history should be a steer. But I guess I have a question for you, Mr. Minister Brown, is we talk about history, but we also have the future. What do you think? How do you think the next generation of Black Africans around the world, what's going to be, where should the balance lie now between looking forward in terms of what we can do for the future generations, our children, our grandchildren, and also the continuation to look back into the past as a steer? And the reason why I ask this question is that I feel in my heart, especially as I spend a lot more time in Ghana, and you see that obviously a lot of the pilgrims and the tourists and the people that are coming back to the motherland, is like the question is being asked, how long, how much further, or how much longer, or to what degree should the focus be on the historical narrative, especially in relation to white supremacy, balanced or compared against what we should be doing moving forward over the next 10, 50, 100 years? Where should that balance be, in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, that balance has to be centered in the beginning, in our concept of how the world, how the universe functions. And that takes us right back to the beginning. And it's always prevalent with us. It's not something we have to give a great deal of thought to, because we're involved in the process of how Africans saw the universe and how it operates at all times. It's with us. If you breathe, you breathe the air that is permeating every aspect of not only humanity, but of creation. Every aspect of creation is breathing the same air. Well, maybe not the same air, but it's breathing, but air is flowing through. Yeah. Air is a component of life, of creation, of everything. The soil that we eat is through every living organism. We eat it. We eat the gold, the diamonds. I mean, it's in trace amounts, but I mean, it's a part of us. The water we drink, our body is 72% water. So that water is not just flowing through oceans and rivers, but it's flowing through us at the same time. And it's flowing through all of us. And so we're the water, and the sun is the energy that gives life to all living on the planet. And that sun beats in our heart. It's like that sacred drumbeat that is in all of life, that we share together, that we dance with, that we move with. You know, if you cover the grass for a few days and it can't get sunlight, it dies.
Yeah.
I mean, so when we look at it, we are the earth. And if we are the earth, our thinking will impact the earth and what we do on the earth. So if we think together, then and we apply the principles that regulate much of our reaction and our balance, because our ancestors understood that our balance and our truth is a mathematical expression of an African equation. Truth is a mathematical expression of an African equation of life. It's the vibrations. It's everything that that has movement within this union, and this being of life is expressed in vibrations. And mathematics is the most accurate expression of those vibrations that we have. And that's why we could build the pyramids and so forth. So you can't get away from that. It's not like you can start study somewhere out in space and arrive at a mathematical true expression of where we are today. You have to first understand that we have an impact on what the planet is, what it becomes, everything. Our thinking is not without a manifestation. So once we understand that, then we're in a better position to create the kind of societies and the kind of world that we want to bring about, because we can directly impact that as long as we understand that relationship. I don't understand why it's so hard for people to see anything other than their oneness with nature. It boggles my mind that's not a given, if you understand what I'm saying.
I do understand, and it's quite fitting you talk about that. I've just come back from a 2-month trip to Ghana, and I always say I believe I'm a guided person. So when I go somewhere, I always seem to meet the people that I know that my life journey's meant for me to meet. And I spent time with an individual who is he's a very, very knowledgeable person about plants. He's someone that wasn't taught formally in school. He's not been taught herbalism formally, but he understands trees and plants like no other. So what you just said about being in one with nature, I was able to spend time with this individual. He's a 60-year-old who looks like a 30-year-old. He's never taken any Western medication, and he spent a long time explaining to me and my cousin about the concept of trees and plants in Africa, what they're used for medicinally and what they're used for spiritually. And he described certain things to us that we never knew existed, certain places in Ghana that most people wouldn't believe existed, in terms of like the variation of plants and what these plants do, and their effect on the human body, and how they interact between us and them, and between themselves. And I left Ghana with a wealth of information, and it was a really, really, really special time to spend with him. So I think he, more than anyone in my life, has sort of really made me just understand and fully and more appreciate anyway this oneness with nature that you talk about. I always know it's the case and it's the truth, but spending so much time with him and seeing how he uses plants and how he interacts with them on a day-to-day basis, he definitely inspired me to learn more.
Thank you so much. Darrell, I don't know.
Darrell, you can go ahead and close us out. You can go ahead and close us out.
Okay, Darrell.
Can I say one more thing before we go?
Brother Harris?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention I appreciate all these comments so much, and you've got me thinking a bit more. And when I wrote these volumes on Harrison, it's been so many years, but it was always with the notion that what I'm writing is for current and future generations, for people to draw on. And I think people like you folks who are here can really take some of what Harrison wrote and did and take it much further than I was capable of taking it. There's a couple of things I want to just mention. He does a wonderful series of talks, 10 classes on world problems of race, which people might find interesting, going all the way back through the centuries. He also writes a wonderful article entitled Wanted a Colored International. On democracy, he really has some stunning comments on democracy in America and how it's put forth. And so I think if you get to look at the book, I hope you all get to read it. There'll be much in there for so many people, you and your friends and others. I just encourage people to read it. And again, as best I can figure out, Harrison's ancestors, at least on his father's side, the folks from St. Croix, his mother's from Barbados, probably came from Ghana, because there was a major part of the population from Ghana. And he offers some comments on some of the customs that are maintained in St. Croix, which he attributes to African customs. So again, I quoted him and I put it in there, but others would be able to best judge. But there it is. And thank you for letting me participate in this. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. And because you've mentioned that he might well have some Ghanaian ancestry, there's even one more reason for me to delve into this gentleman even more. I'll be honest with you, I had not heard of Hubert Harrison up until about 6 months ago, when it was Darrell that gave me some insight into this individual, and especially his influence and impact on some of the other great African-American leaders that many more of us have heard about. So since then, I've done some research on him, and I can tell that he's a titan in the history of what we've stood for. And thank you to you for going to the effort. I'm definitely going to purchase your book. I know Darrell got a copy.
And get it in the libraries. We want it in the libraries so the masses can have access.
Yeah. Do you know what? I'll go one step further. I will order 2 copies. And there's a school that I support in Ghana, and the kids are young, but what we always feel like we've dropped certain books there in the hope that even one individual, one boy or girl might pick up and read a couple of pages and just get inspired that some people like this actually existed. People like this actually existed that can pull crowds of 50,000 people and speak to them and give them truth and guidance. So we also decided we're going to be naming a road.
I heard that's wonderful.
In Ghana. There's a few individuals that we feel have contributed so much that it's nice if they're honored in some capacity. And maybe again in the years to come when we're all gone, people can ask, who is this man? What a woman? And what did he or she do? And it would inspire them. So thank you as well.
Kwabena.
Yes, Minister Brown.
I heard that I was among some of those that was being named.
You are.
Oh man, I can't thank you enough.
No.
The only problem is I don't know why.
I'll tell you why, and I'll say it here live. But before I say why, I should have done this in reverse, because again, this trip in Ghana has been it's been beautiful in the sense that the world is lucky to still have you here with us. I even feel very honored to be able to speak to you directly here and now in the live. And the fitting way for us to have done that, I should have come to you first, explained what I would have loved to do for you, explain why we want to do what we're doing for you and for us, and ask your blessing and permission. I think I got it in the wrong way round. I know since then, the role's indicated and you've just intimated that we have your blessings to do it, but I should have come and asked you first, because thank God you're still with us. So apologies for that. As to the why, I've always, when I first started, the book that changed my life was the autobiography of Malcolm X. I read that when I was about 13, 14. And from then I started reading lots of different books, but I always knew that there was an institution in this world called the University of Timbuktu in the ancient Mali, which was like a place that housed so much deep literature and truth about this world. And the Greeks and the Romans and the Africans and everyone passed through this place to gain knowledge. And I honestly believe that transatlantic productions and what you and Darrell and your team do, especially you as the founder and figurehead, I see your institution like the modern day Timbuktu. And I see you like the dean of that university. So if people around the world can come to your channels and learn some of the pearls of wisdom and the truths from what you've done and your effort, that is the reason why I felt someone like you and your spirit should be honored forever in the motherland, because what you do and what you've done is not a joke. You're like a missionary for our race. And if someone spends even an hour on your channel and viewing some of the people you've collated, they're going to be a wiser and more learned individual or spirit in this world. So that is the why. I think is wholly deserved. Thank you for what you've done for us.
I am so honored. I am so honored. My life has been so blessed to have done what I've done that it was not a sacrifice. It was a blessing. I've enjoyed every moment. I've been blessed every moment, and I've had very few negative, hurtful days or moments in this journey. It has opened like a great door, and it has been so beautiful and so marvelous. And I've been so deeply in love with it that it's all been a great experience of love. I know what love is because that's what I've had from my ancestors and from traveling the land that they left their footprints in.
Yeah.
And trying to understand those footprints it's just been beautiful. It's so I thank you. I'm honored deeply, and I couldn't be more deeply rewarded.
And it's a beautiful piece of land. Like you're overlooking, you're on the base of like a hill. It's very, very beautiful. It's one of our new sites in Pram Pram, which is by the coast. So there's still some work to go into cutting the roads. We'll probably put your road sign in the next couple of weeks. It's been prepared. It's finished. I've shown Darrell, but yeah, it's going to be pretty cool, and you deserve it. And you're close to Amos Wilson, and you're close to we've got Hubert Harrison there. We've got Kwame Nkrumah in that sector. So you're close to some pretty cool cats, and you're one of them. You probably and we got Muhammad Ali there as well. So
oh yeah. I just hope that I get a chance to get back to Ghana.
You will. You will. You will.
Yeah.
You definitely will. You definitely will. Thank you.
All right. I'm just going to ask Darrell if he can close us out. Jeffrey, we told you an hour. We've done an hour and a half, and we're looking forward to having you back. I think this was just a marvelous session, and I appreciate it. I thank you, Kwame. I thank you. I appreciate everything. And Darrell, thank you, man. Thank you so much.
All praise to Darrell.
Yeah. Thank you all again. I totally appreciate it. And it was a joy for me to be here participating with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Good day, everybody.